So, last month, the patrons voted for two ships to be recorded as 5-minute guides, i.e. they managed to do a score draw. I have a feeling that may have been intentional. One of which was USS Galena, which you've obviously seen before. The other was HMS Victory. But come on, it's HMS Victory. There's no way that's ever going to be just a 5-minute guide. And so I asked them, and they accepted my offer to, rather than just put a 5-minute guide out for Victory, to actually go down to Portsmouth and have a look at Victory, take some footage of Victory, and incorporate it into a much longer special video. And that is what you are about to experience today. So hope you enjoy it, and let's get on with it. Well, we're starting our visit, this first visit to Portsmouth Historic Dockyard with a quick look across the boathouse. There's a landing craft there being renovated, and I think I may have found a backdrop for a studio if I ever do live video. A little bit big though. Anyways, we'll press on to the Victory soon enough. So unfortunately, the footage I recorded outside is basically unusable as far as audio goes because of wind noise, but there she is, HMS Victory, as she stands in 2019 on a rather wonderful early June summer's day. And you can see the pennant there going quite substantially, and there's a mock-up of the hull there. You can see on the triangular mount just in front, and over there is HMS Queen Elizabeth. Old and new contrasting quite nicely. And so we come around the bow of the ship. Now obviously you can see here the shape of the hull, how it bulges out towards the waterline, and you have the rather pronounced tumble home typical of wooden warships of the 19th century there. Nice big anchor sitting there on the dockside as well. And there's the bow, very bluff, nowhere near as sharp and pointed as on later designs, coming up to the rather elegant prow. They've taken off the figurehead for preservation work. Looks like the sun's gone in. The sky is a typical British grey with occasional patches of heretical blue. So there we go. Let's see if we can get aboard. And there's the white ensign there you can see flying, as HMS Victory is of course still a commissioned warship in Her Majesty's Navy. Well, after the incidents on the Lyther, no safety helmets this time. But yeah, that's the entrance and exit height, that's the lower ceiling height. Here's roughly where my eye height is, and that's roughly where my head height is. So bumps, of course, are to be expected. So as we head aboard, it's probably important to know something of the history of the ship. HMS Victory is, of course, a first-rate ship of the line, one of the Royal Navy's flagships, and the oldest commissioned warship in the world. Back in the 18th century, the first-rate ship of the line was the single most technologically advanced item that could be produced by mankind, and it could move as well. However, they were not common. The bulk of the battle fleets of major navies were made up of third-rates and fourth-rates, although the latter were gradually disappearing in the larger navies. A few second-rates were also around, but first-rates were rare, occupying the same kind of niche as the supercarrier does today. They were big, expensive to build, and expensive to run, with even the mighty Royal Navy not able to afford to maintain many of them, despite the advantage that such ships had given them in previous wars, such as the Anglo-Dutch wars of a century before. During times of peace, they were often placed in deep reserve, only brought back into service when needed. Luckily, the advance of naval technology was of a speed such that a ship could spend a decade or two in reserve and then, with relatively minimal work, go right back to being a frontline combat unit, providing that care and attention was paid during the ship's time in ordinary, which was the term they used for reserve service back then. This tended to mean that first-rate ships could last for decades, and thus needed replacement relatively infrequently. At least in the hands of the Royal Navy, which, occasional annoying Dutchmen aside, was generally pretty good at keeping its hand on its first rates, supplemented occasionally by helpful donations in action from foreign navies, usually the French. The name HMS Victory had a varied history in the mid-1750s. The Anglo-Dutch War era had had a second rate of that name launched in 1620, which lasted 70 years before being broken up. and then a first rate of 100 guns, the HMS Royal James, had taken up the name in 1691 to maintain continuity. The ship itself lasting from build a total of 46 years before being accidentally burnt in 1721, the fate of a worryingly large number of major capital ships over the centuries in the Age of Sail. 16 years later, a new first-rate Victory had been launched, but after commissioning as what would turn out to be the last British capital ship armed entirely with the more expensive bronze cannon, as opposed to the developing mass-produced iron guns, she only lasted 4 years before being wrecked in a storm and lost with all hands on her way back from a successful naval operation in 1744. Now, 14 years after that disaster, William Pitt the Elder, then Prime Minister, placed an order for the building of 12 ships, including a single first-rate ship. The rarity of first-rates can be illustrated that, despite the fact that Britain was involved in numerous major wars in the 18th century, this order was one of only 10 first-rate ships that were to be constructed during that entire 100-year period, and one of those had been the previous Victory. As with most ships of the period, she was supposed to be an iterative design, with first drafts based on HMS Royal George, another first-rate that had recently been launched. The job of turning this into a detailed design for the new ship was providentially given to the master naval architect Sir Thomas Slade, who was also Surveyor of the Navy. As a first-rate, she was to carry at least 100 guns and would be built in the Chatham Dockyard. The keel was laid on the 23rd of July 1759, and her name, Victory, was finally chosen in October 1760. It's possible, although not entirely possible to confirm, that the name was chosen as much to commemorate 1759, the so-called Annus Mirabilis, or Year of Miracles, in the 7 Years' War, as it was to continue the line of ships named Victory in the Royal Navy, as there were a little bit of discontent over reusing the name after such a major disaster as the previous ship had been. There is also a more prosaic reason. Out of just over half a dozen names the Admiralty had come up with that were suitable for one of the Royal Navy's major combat units, it turned out they'd already made ships named after all but one of them, and Victory was the only one that wouldn't require bringing in another ship and renaming that one as well. This was where a series of very fortunate events began to chain together. Firstly, Sir Thomas Slade was a naval architectural genius who was not content to merely iterate, but in fact make a number of small innovations and improvements on the design that he'd been tasked with. Next, the 7 Years' War ended, so whilst it was common practice to build the ship's frame and then leave the wood to season over, say, spring and summer, the sudden slowdown in construction meant that Victory would stay covered and seasoning for almost 3 years, which would massively increase the endurance of her basic structure. She was finally ready to go in May 1765 at a total cost of £63,176 and 3 shillings. Now that might not seem like much today, and indeed a simple inflation calculator would suggest that this is equivalent to 8 to 11 million pounds in today's money. But in terms of actual economic cost to the country, a truer estimate of the impact on national finances, or what you might deem purchasing power, would be something in the order of just over £1 billion. Now, this isn't to say that the launch, or more accurately the floating out of dry dock, went without issue. As the ship was so large, the dock gates were not quite wide enough to let it through, which led to a frantic night's work with edzes paring back the gates, followed presumably by much careful standing around and whistling by the dockyard crew so that nobody noticed that the rather expensive dock gates now looked like they'd been attacked by the world's biggest hamster. There were also a few errors made in construction that meant that she required more ballast to give her an even keel, and as with many first-rates, the lower gun ports were somewhat close to the waterline, being just under 5 feet away. However, with these issues resolved and the war pretty much over, there was little need to keep an expensive first-rate in service, and so Victory went pretty much immediately into reserve, gathering barnacles and weed on the River Medway, where a young Horatio Nelson, at this time an aspiring cadet of no particular note, was passing by daily whilst being taught basic riverine navigational skills. So far, you might think, she hasn't shown all that much in terms of innovative design. But when she was moved, the huge first rate, even encrusted as she was, still outsailed her escort ships. Slade's work had given the Royal Navy one of the fastest such ships ever constructed, capable of 11 knots at a time when most ships of the line were several knots slower, and even some frigates would struggle to reach this speed. Her sheer size and bulk also meant that she could sustain this speed in much higher seas than the vast majority of other warships. In 1778, her time of rest came to an end, as France had joined the American War of Independence, and Victory was needed to resist any potential actions by the French fleet. Her hull was painted red, although this has no connection to her going faster, as far as I can discern, and her first loadout of weaponry was craned aboard. The lower gun deck was given 30 42-pounder cannon, with 28 24-pounder long guns on her middle deck, and 30 12-pounders on her upper gun deck, along with 12 6-pounders on her quarterdeck and forecastle. The lower gun deck armament varied wildly over the next few years, with the 42-pounders being very powerful, but proving difficult to rapidly reload in a seaway, and so they were replaced with 32-pounders. Then it was ordered to swap back again to the 42-pounders, but they now couldn't find enough of the heavier guns, and so they went back again for a third set of gun changes to the 32-pounders. Which would then give the ship most of the armament it would subsequently utilise throughout its career. Let's have a look at that armament now. Well, here we are starting aboard the ship on the middle gun deck. Here you have the long 24-pounder guns, and you can see here the Royal Navy's standard gun carriages. 4 wheels, lots of rope, because you don't want one of these things going rocketing across the middle of the ship in combat. So these guns would have made up the primary armament of some of the smaller ships of the line, some of the smaller third rates, and the very largest frigates, generally speaking. So ships like USS Constitution, this is the kind of main heavy armament for them, but on a capital ship like HMS Victory, a first-rate ship of the line, this is what you might call in later periods pretty much the secondary battery. Got some of the cannonballs down there, 24-pound weight. I wonder if you can pick them up. Nope, they are locked in place. And there's some cutlasses for boarding actions, and here is the access ways up and down the decks. See, the ceilings here are not terribly low, which is quite nice. So shall we progress? Some canvas screens here, and here is some of the gunnery equipment. So you have your ramrod for ramming down the cannonball and wadding. You have your screw worm. This is for taking out bits of wadding that might be stuck in the gun after you fired it, and a nice big sponge here to tamp down and sponge out a lot of the burning bits of wadding and any unspent gunpowder. So you definitely don't want. Oh, hang on a sec. As I was saying, you do not want any burning bits of wadding or gunpowder in the gun when you put fresh gunpowder down. That's an easy way to lose an arm. And here you have a powder horn. That's obviously to allow them to top off the touch hole, which can be found on the top of the gun, just there. Let's get a gunner's eye view. The lid is somewhat shut, that's not very helpful. We'll try and see if there's another gun with an open gun port somewhere else. And we can see from the ropes here just how thick these ropes needed to be to stop the recoil. Obviously they have to be securely mounted to the ship, but these guns had to be stopped in a very, very short space of time, because as you can see there's not a tremendous amount of space behind them for the recoil. And going up on to the upper deck, there's a drum. We're going all the way up, missing the upper gun deck, and up onto the main deck. Well, there's the wheel. Let's see what else we can find. So here on the main deck we have a small battery of guns on either side, just 6 of them there, supplementing the ship's firepower. Obviously these are going to be lighter weight guns. And there on the top, unfortunately, we are not allowed, thanks to this small bit of rope, which we will respect, Um, there's the ready-use ammunition, somewhat less vulnerable to explosions than later types of ammunition. And as we come around here, you see there's the steering, and here is where Nelson fell in battle, say 214 years ago, near enough. So if we proceed along here, tripping over my own feet. Here is the ship's steering wheel, double steering wheel, as you can actually see, and there's the rope leading down that way to the actual rudder and tiller, and there's part of the mast coming up through there. This was mostly shot away and people who were manning it were killed during the Battle of Trafalgar. Now here at the stern of the ship behind the steering wheel, well, even more guns with gun ports ready to go. And also, as you can see, these windows could also be ratcheted open as gun ports. So although this would have been officers' quarters during normal voyages, you had to live with this kind of thing next to you, and when it was battle time, well, better hope this slot isn't up here, because this is just basically a splinter and shrapnel hazard. So this lot would have gone below, and these would have been run out depending on what you were fighting. If you're fighting a broadside action like Trafalgar, would have gone through those gun ports, and if you were in the middle of a stern chase, well, or you're being chased, or you need to shoot at someone behind you, you could set them up to fire through here. And there's the little windows, and there's the modern version of the Victory sitting out there. That's a nice effect there, isn't it? And this is how you will sleep aboard the ship. Well, at least if you're an officer. Men get hammocks, you get this nice little hanging cot thing. You definitely don't want a bed so much unless you like being spilled out everywhere. There's your little fold up bit of furniture there, but you can see what the problem with raking is, because yeah, if a cannonball comes through that, and that glass is not really going to stop all that much, and yeah, these are just, no, don't even think about trying to stop a cannonball with that. There's not really a tremendous amount to stop it just going all the way along the main deck, is there? So let's come back out again. So looking back across the ship, there's the ship's boat. Don't know what you can see up there, I can't, above my head. You've got the ventilation here, and this is also where obviously men would sometimes come up and down if it was opened. It wouldn't have the glass there, historically speaking. There off to our right is Victory's 300 or so years before it was built ancestor, Mary Rose, sitting quite happily away in its museum, which we'll go and see on another day. This weather really is quite foul. Let's head below. Going to the upper gun deck from topside. This is not the most necessarily safe of steps, but I suppose you get used to it. Unfortunately, the wind was blowing so badly through the hatches at this point that the audio is pretty much unusable. So yeah, there you see hammocks as used by the crew. This is on the upper gun deck, and then as we come through, these are the 12-pounder guns that make up what effectively is the ship's tertiary battery, but would be the primary armament of light frigates, say 6th rates, and the secondary battery on the heavy frigates and on small ships of the line. These long 12-pounders just here. So if we have a pan around quickly, you can see that there's quite a number of these guns here, and there's their cannonballs. You can see much smaller than some of the other ones that we've seen earlier. And if we have a look to the left, come on past me, there we go, then you can see the carpentry tools, all very important because the ship is of course made of wood, so this is how you keep the ship intact. And over here we see that there are some rather ahistorical buckets there, and one authentic one. Coming around here, very helpfully signed "Please do not touch," is a case of flintlock pistols of worryingly large caliber for use in boarding actions or to defend the ship, and some swords, because never enough swords. Bearing in mind as you look down the gun deck that this would be where you ate, lived, worked, slept, and possibly died. Hopefully not the latter if you were lucky, but it's it's a nice big space, well, apart from the ceiling bit, it's a nice big space if you are just one or two people wandering around, but I would not want to necessarily live here with several hundred other people. And there's some muskets and bayonets, of course, can't go anywhere without your bayonet in boxes. And here's the continuation of that hatch system you saw up top, because remember, this is 18th century, there is no air conditioning, so you better hope those get the air down to the lower parts of the ship, otherwise it's going to get very muggy very, very quickly. Some more of the ship's equipment there. Boarding pikes, also good at repelling boarders, and gunpowder, I think, for the 12-pounder guns. Yeah, there you go. Sea service canister shot 12-pounder guns. Well, there you go, that's what a canister shot looks like before it turns into a gigantic flying shotgun shell. And here's one of the more important things for a battle-damaged ship. Lots of buckets and a pump. You might be wondering, well, hang on a minute, we're not on the upper deck, where the heck's this pump going? Well, this pump goes much further down into the ship, below the waterline. We're now, as you can hopefully see, despite the glare out there, we are well above the waterline. And in battle, you don't really want this on the upper deck, on the main deck, sorry, because you're just going to get, this is going to get shot away, or the people on it are going to get shot away. So this is about the best place for this pump. Pump water out of the ship, into the buckets, out through the gun ports. And another drum to help them keep time in battle. Now going into the aft section of the ship. And this, in the darkness, is part of the Admirals Quarters. Upstairs, some more public entertainment and such. Probably kept in first officer, something like that. Got these side cabins, which you can't see into because they're blocked off. But we're going to go into the Admirals Quarters in a second, where there's currently a tour going on, so we'll just wait for them to finish. And here, off in the side of the ship, is the one of the ship's toilets. Nice little enclosed space. Probably might get a bit warm in sunny weather, I would imagine. And then ducking back out, you're into the day cabin. Nelson's day cabin. There's his writing desk where he wrote letters back to home. Nice little carpet. Some rather worn seat. This is where he would have done most of his business during the day, and there are some charts and maps. Please do not touch, of course. There's the other toilet that way, and then this is the dining cabin for Admiral Nelson. As you can tell, he usually had guests. If you don't fancy a trip to the stern, there's a toilet there, and here is where Nelson sleeps. This is about as fancy as it gets on this ship. Another rather important piece of the ship's equipment, grinding wheel to keep your keep your swords sharp and to sharpen up any other metallic instruments you might have. Also notice the emblem on the guns, George Rex, because of course this is of the period of the various King Georges. It's very important, you don't want to mislay your gun, and if you mislay your gun, then you can also find out where it's gone, who it used to belong to. And there, out there, all somewhat good by large box, is the Monitor M33. So now we're going to descend back onto the 24-pounder deck. So now we're on the 24-pounder deck. You can see the cannonballs have gone up a little bit. This is the deck we came in on. Guns are substantially chunkier. And, oh look, even more muskets. Now what have we got here? Well, here's the men's sea chests, also impromptu seats, and the mess tables that they sat at. Obviously lots of stuff made of wood and horn. Metal, obviously not tending to last very long at sea when it's in thin portions like you might find in the side of a mug or in a plate. Obviously these things are a little bit more durable. And over here we have the kitchen. Jokes about English cooking aside, they did try and keep as much fresh produce as they could, albeit they didn't last too long. There's the infamous hardtack. It'll keep you nourished, and if worse comes to worse in a boarding action, I suppose you've got an impromptu melee weapon as well. And here is the galley stove. And you might notice these are again copper, partly again rust issues, but also you have to make sure that you keep as much of the ship spark free as possible. With so much gunpowder around, use of copper, which obviously doesn't spark as opposed to iron or steel, is ideal, but obviously some of this stuff has to be because, well, you can't stick a long copper rod into that and expect it to stay intact for very long. I think I'll pass. And this is the bow of the ship, so you can see the last guns. That's the last gun that's properly facing starboard. This gun's facing probably about 30 degrees off kilt to starboard. And then there's another gun port which brings you round to face almost forward, chase guns, and you can see here the bowsprit coming down, so it's come down through the upper gun deck, now on the middle gun deck, and we can go around to face down the port side gun deck. And coming down the port side again, you can see the galley stove, quite the complex bit of machinery, but then considering how many people it was feeding on this deck, and possibly others, depending on where the others were in action, not exactly surprising. There's the chimney for it. So now we're going to proceed down onto the lower gun deck, and this is where things get really interesting. And the cannonballs have stepped up in size again. It's quite dark down here, although again not quite as large as the 64-pounders, or 68-pounders, the carronades anyway. Here is the hammocks. Well, here's where they are at the minute, the hammocks. This is the typical accommodation for your average sailor. And down here, you can see with hammocks slung across that one and food set up next to it. These are the business end of the Victory. These are the 32-pounder long guns. These are the things which can smash through any ship's hull known in the late 18th and early 19th centuries. They are found generally only on capital warships, first-rate, second-rate ships of the line, some of the larger third-rates, and it is these guns that will do the majority of the execution when it comes to the large fleet battles. And it is also these guns which would give some of the larger Rasay frigates certain degrees of advantage over their more regular frigate-built cousins, because on the larger 74s that were cut down to Rasay frigates, they would retain these monstrous weapons on their lower gun decks, which would obviously substantially outgun any normal frigate that had a 18 or 12-pounder main battery, and even still outclass the kind of heavy frigates of Endymion, Constitution and all that sort of thing with their 24-pounder main armaments. You can see the deck is substantially wider here. This is probably about the widest point on the hull, maybe this and the next deck down. And there's another pump here. Can't be without too many pumps. And rather interesting bit of mechanical apparatus. There you go. This is a much larger pump array, I believe. And there's a mast. I think this is the main mast. Yes, this is the middle of the three, the largest of the three, coming down through the ship. Just going forward. No, we are going aft, sorry. Yes, so we're going aft, so there's the rear mast, and unlike the upper and middle gun decks, there are no accommodation here at the back of the ship. It's just gun deck all the way through, near enough front to back. There's some of the crew's effects. Gunpowder charges, spare rope, and with that said, let's see if we can find out where we're going down further still. Capstan for manual winding. The sticks for that will be around here somewhere. You can see the sheer scale of some of the ropes that they had to do. That is a fairly big rope, I would say. And so coming down from the lower gun deck, well, this is the sight that confronts me. Might need to duck a bit. This is the orlop deck where the surgeon's cockpit is. There's various medical devices, etc. and accommodations. This is below the waterline for obvious reasons. You don't want to end up having to fight in a battle and then have your own medical section blown up whilst you're having a treatment. So all casualties brought below deck. So Snelson was brought down through all the gun decks to this level. This is obviously not part of the medical deck section. This is cheese storage. Very vital, I must admit. Almost as vital as the medical deck itself. And a whole load of nice barrels. Snelson would have been stuck in one of these full of alcohol for his trip home. There's the stern quarters, and of course all the wonderful instruments involved in trying to keep people alive, mostly by removing limbs, because cannibals don't do very nice things to limbs. Yeah, like that. And here, just forward of the surgeon's cockpit on the port side of the ship, here is the spot where Snelson breathed his last at the end of the Battle of Trafalgar. This would have been full of screaming wounded men at the time. Pretty dark, not exactly the nicest of places to die, but relatively quiet for all that, apart from obviously the men themselves. Rather a grim place, to be honest. And here we have part of the ship's main magazine, completely copper plated, again to prevent sparks. We'll see more of that later. Well, it's completely dark down here because obviously there are no portholes below the waterline. But you can see some of the structure, the massive timber structure of the ship, and the iron strapping that helped hold it all together. Because, yeah, wood otherwise does stuff like that. But these are hugely thick timbers designed to support the weight of the ship. And, ouch. 2 less brain cells. And yeah, rather impressive nest of cabling down there. That is even bigger. Each of the winds on that big cable there is as big as the whole cable that I put in my hand earlier. That is a substantial old rope, you would say. Here we are at the front of the ship, still on the orlop deck in the bosun's store. So you see spare rope is kept here, spare tackle, pulleys, axes and hatchets. All very important because a lot of this stuff would get damaged or destroyed in combat, so it's always important to have replacements. Varying scales. And a hat. Even varying scales of tackle. This is actually one of the advances the Royal Navy made during this period. First production line that could turn out uniform products for this stuff, because there's an awful lot of these that go into the makeup of a ship's rigging. And the one problem with hand carving them all is, one, it takes forever, and two, they're all very slightly different, which can lead to all sorts of interesting problems. But, let's say, Royal Navy managing to form a mass production line for these things could guarantee they're all the same size and shape for a given category, and thus interchangeable, which is very, very useful. Logistics is what the experts study. Just going forward here, there's a bit more rope there. More storage. I swear my back is going to kill me after this. Even more swords. And a whole load of naval pattern muskets. Slightly shorter, these ones. As you can see, they're not quite as tall as I am. In fact, they're probably about shoulder height without the bayonets attached. And yeah, so this is where they would have been worked on more of the bosun's stores. Very nice little place here. There's the foremast coming down through there. It's really quiet, deceptively quiet, especially considering what the weather's like out up top. Carpenter's store here. Carpenter's tools. Wedges, very important. Hammers. Leather apron. A few bits and pieces under repair, as you can see. Walls. Those scoop things there, probably for hot tar, because you can see all the decks are caulked and tarred, keep them watertight. And oh look, Another brain cell hazard. Let's duck down that and see if we can go even further down. We're now in the very bowels of the ship. You can see timbers supporting the outer hull. That is the bottom of the ship down there in the darkness. There's the ship's ballast, very important for keeping it upright. Barrels of stores, barrels of water, barrels of food, barrels of pretty much anything you can think of. Also, obviously, all very heavy, all help keeping the ship ballasted. And there is the keel of the ship, running full length fore and aft. It's more of the structure of the ship. Well, if you went down that set of ladders, you'd be right down on the bottom of the hull, but we're not allowed to. So let's see what else we can find around here, down in the poorly focused darkness. Right, down here, some ammunition storage, some examples of the various types of shot they use. So you can see there's some grape shot, some bar shot, varying types. This one looks like a barbell, that one looks like a more classic barbell, but that's all bar shot. There's some chain shot, you can see the splits there, and some classic round shot all stored here. And the reason for that is because this is part of the ship's magazine, which we'll see in a minute. Since it's flash photography that's not forbidden and not lit photography, there's some slightly more in-focus shots of the ballast, the stores, the base of the ship. There's the keel. Let's see what else we can see. Oh look, more rope. There's a surprise. And here you can see a form of internal subdivision. I mean, it's not the world's thickest bulkhead. It does have holes in it, but obviously there are hatches for that, but it's a form of watertight integrity, which means if the ship starts flooding, it's not going to get completely flooded through a single breach in the hold. This bit of the ship is a little bit more empty, where they've taken the ballast out for ventilation purposes from it, and there's the keel continuing to run the length of the ship. And that is that, going out through the ship's side, coming out underwater. Lost a couple more brain cells on a few of the decks in lost footage. Ow, those hurt. Yeah, it turns out my head is not as well protected as the structural timbers of a first-rate ship of the line. Who knew? So the new supports going in, keeping the ship all propped up. This is obviously one of the ventilation holes turned into a gift shop access, and it's a pretty nice sight up the side of the ship there, I think. People going aboard, people going under. Turns out the magazines are under refit, so I will have to describe them to you separately, maybe with some previous pictures. And so now you've actually been through the ship, let's get back to some history of the ship's operation. So, if you can remember back about half an hour, the ship has just got into active service, and as the flagship of Admiral Keppel, just under 30 British ships of the line would sight and engage a roughly equivalent French force on the 23rd of July 1778, about 100 miles west of Ushant. The French wanted to avoid battle, and they had the weather gauge, which in Age of Sail terms means the wind is behind you relative to the enemy. This allows you to bear down on them at will, whilst they have to fight upwind if they want to close. But the British fleet was between them and their home port, and so after a lot of wind, rain and manoeuvring, battle became unavoidable. However, the French managed an opposing pass on the British column before making a break for safety, with Victory engaging the first-rate Bretagne of 110 guns and the second-rate Ville de Paris of 90 guns. The battle was therefore somewhat inconclusive due to the single pass of gunfire. 2 years later, in 1780, Victory was sheathed in copper, which allowed her to retain her excellent sailing capabilities for far longer than was previously normal, and she was back out to sea with 11 other ships of the line and a half-dozen escorts before long. Their target this time was a French merchant convoy, but when they found it, they discovered a large force of around 20 French ships of the line protecting the convoy. Luckily, however, the escort was downwind of said convoy, and so the British decided to content themselves with stealing 3/4 of the merchantmen before the escort could tack upwind to engage them, and then made off with all the prizes, leaving what was left of the convoy to a rising gale. This actually had a significant knock-on effect, as the convoy and many of the escort were bound for the Caribbean, and with most of that force dispersed or captured, only a handful actually made it to their destination, leaving a French force intended to capture Jamaica outnumbered 36 to 33 at the Battle of the Saints, where Admiral Rodney would capture 4 of their number, destroy another, and heavily damage the rest, which ended French ambitions to mop up Britain's Caribbean holdings, at least for the minute. In 1782, some upgrades were due. The 6-pounder guns on the upper deck were replaced with 12-pounders, and at some point in this period they also acquired a pair of 68-pounder carronades for her bow armament. Annoyingly, the Royal Navy doesn't actually count short-range carronades when it comes to listing the ship's total guns, which means that in this period the listed gun rating for Royal Navy warships is often quite misleading due to only the long guns being included. Now obviously these can be found on the upper deck alongside the ship's bell. Again, wind noise make this completely atrocious. Unlike the Lyther's bell, they have roped this one in place so you can't ring it. But if you go over to, this is the starboard bow of the deck, you can see here the complexity of the rigging involved. This is only part of the rigging, remember, because this is just holding up the foremast. The upper masts and a lot of the sails and lines aren't in yet. There is a 12-pounder gun on the upper deck, obviously, as I said, having replaced the 6-pounders. And there's one of the 68-pounder carronades. Now, as you can also notice, this is not on a standard carriage, unlike the 12-pounder over there. This is just effectively on a swivel mount. It's got a rather vicious recoil, even though it is obviously a slightly reduced charge. And here you can see it's got these little trunnion wheels, and that allows the gun to be slewed using these ropes to the left and right, giving it a fair degree of maneuverability as compared to the 12-pounder here, which effectively is just going forward and backwards. So come around to the front and you can see these are the 68-pounder carronade balls. They are the largest bits of ammunition on the ship. Quite substantial firepower present there. And then if we go round past the foremast, slip through that little gap, there is the other one. So, with these additional armaments in place, Victory led a force of 35 ships of the line in an effort to resupply Gibraltar. The Franco-Spanish blockading force was 49 strong, but a powerful storm dispersed them, wrecking one, sending another to have fun under Gibraltar's gunfire, and seeing another winding up blown clean into the Mediterranean. As a result, the resupply effort proceeded unhindered, and the British were on their way back out again when 38 enemy ships that had managed to stay vaguely together showed up. Thanks to the coppering of the British fleet, the battle force and the departing merchants were able to slip away back home without much action being engaged in. This was because protection of the merchant resupply convoy was seen as the priority over fighting the Spanish. Victory would remain as flagship of the Mediterranean fleet for the following couple of years, attacking the French arsenal in Toulon and then being involved in an action off of the Jervis Islands, I think, Hyères, with a weird accent mark above the middle E. Anyway, where a much larger British force encountered a French fleet about 60% its size, thanks in large part to the now Captain Nelson aboard HMS Agamemnon, who had been detached with leading a force of frigates on scouting duty, then detected the French fleet, spotting them and signalling to the rest of the fleet. Although the battle would be ended prematurely by Admiral Hotham aboard HMS Britannia signalling his ships to fall back after becoming concerned that they'd become too spread out in the chase, by the time the order was given, HMS Victory had managed to race ahead of the rest of the fleet in company with the 74-gun ships HMS Culloden and HMS Cumberland, and was happily engaged with blasting away at the rear of the French line. Another 2 years would pass until, in 1797, Victory would be flying the flag of Admiral Sir John Jervis. Due to other setbacks in 1796, the British were being forced to withdraw from the Mediterranean, and so Jervis had placed his 10 ships off Cape St. Vincent to prevent the Spanish from interfering with Captain Nelson, and there he is again, who was in charge of the evacuation of Elba. With the evacuation accomplished, Nelson, aboard HMS Minerva, sailed for Gibraltar, only to be told that the Spanish fleet had passed by some days earlier. He promptly set off to inform Jervis, whilst the Spanish fleet, which never seems to have any particular favour with the weather gods, had been blown off course by strong gales and was trying to get back to Cadiz. Thanks to nightfall and the rise of a thick fog, HMS Minerva snuck right through the enemy fleet without being spotted and joined Jervis on the 13th of February. With reinforcements having arrived, Jervis now had 15 ships of the line. However, thanks to the shielding fog, all Nelson could say was that there was a Spanish fleet, not how large it was. With the British ships in two columns, the formation bore down on the Spanish, with Captain Calder reporting back to Jervis as more and more sails appeared over the horizon. "There are 8 sail of the line, Sir John." "Very well, sir." "There are 20 sail of the line, Sir John." "Very well, sir." "There are 25 sail of the line, Sir John." "Very well, sir." "There are 27 sail of the line, Sir John." However, Jervis was no Admiral Hotham and cut off further reports with the following: "Enough, sir, no more of that. The die is cast, and if there are 50 sail, I will go right through them." This animated a nearby Canadian officer to respond, "Well, that's right, Sir John, and by God we'll give them a damn good licking." The Spanish fleet was caught flat-footed in 2 groups and couldn't quite believe it as a fleet half their size came barrelling down on them with all sails spread. Thoroughly unconcerned, or at least giving a good impression of it, Jervis ordered, "Form a line of battle ahead and astern of the Victory as is most convenient." With this done, only 2 more signals would be hoisted: "Engage the enemy," followed 15 minutes later by "Admiral intends to pass through enemy lines." Using his ship's superior speed and impressive firepower, Jervis drove Victory and the rest of the fleet between the 2 Spanish forces, on the theory that, since this allowed his ships to fire both of their broadsides at the same time, logically, of course, this doubled his firepower, and therefore it would even the odds. The Spanish ships made attempts to cut the British line as they passed, but Victory raked 2 full broadsides into the 112-gun Principe de Asturias, which was leading the effort, with such shattering effect that, to quote Jervis, "She squared her sails, ran clear out of the battle, and did not return." He then ordered his fleet to wheel about to engage the larger Spanish force to prevent the 2 elements of the enemy fleet reuniting. However, some confusion arose as one divisional commander didn't immediately obey. However, Nelson, who had rejoined his actual assignment aboard HMS Captain, saw the intention of Jervis's orders and ordered his ship to immediately turn hard to starboard and head into the melee. This was exactly what Jervis wanted, and other British ships in the rear of the line soon followed. Whilst Nelson was off capturing 2 Spanish first-rates almost single-handed, the 112-gun Salvador del Mundo was being engaged by the small third-rates Diadem and Excellent, when Salvador del Mundo's officers spotted Victory bearing down in a raking position, with a gleam in Jervis's eye and a maniacal laugh on the lips of the carronade gunners. The Spanish ship thus decided it was as good a time as any to call it a day and promptly surrendered. The largest warship in the world at the time, the 4-decker Mahogany Santissima Trinidad, also hauled down her colours briefly before being threatened by other Spanish ships and helped away by frigates. All in all, the British would walk away from this victory with 4 new additions to their fleet. With that stunning success achieved, Victory found herself back home for the first time in a number of years, and was found to have significant weaknesses in her stern timbers, and was therefore declared unfit for active service, instead to be converted into a hospital ship. Fate would intervene again, however, and in 1799 the second-rate HMS Impregnable ran aground and stuck fast. Now finding themselves short of 1 major battle line unit, the Admiralty decided to instead repair the Victory. And so over the next 3 years, at the cost of £70,933, 0 shillings and 0 pence, slightly more than she'd originally cost to build entirely, the Great Repair was undertaken. She had new gun ports added, taking her official rating from 100 to 104 guns. The hull colour was changed from red to the black and yellow that remains to this day, and the magazines were lined with copper for the first time. In May 1803, the restored ship was ready to go and received the now Vice Admiral Nelson, and promptly headed out to sea to meet up with Admiral Cornwallis. Partway along, Nelson would transfer to the frigate HMS Amphion to better find the rest of the fleet that he was to lead, with Victory contenting itself with running down and capturing a French frigate, the 32-gun Ambuscade, which had been a British ship, then captured by the French, and now back in British hands, with Victory using her remarkable turn of speed again to run down an unsuspecting enemy vessel. The next year and a bit was something of a wild goose chase, with the Franco-Spanish combined fleet being thought to first be heading for Egypt, then actually having turned out to have made off for the Caribbean in an effort to draw off the main British fleet so that Napoleon could launch a cross-channel invasion, which was unfortunately not named La Lion de Mer. However, heading back to Europe, the Franco-Spanish fleet had run into another British fleet under Sir Robert Calder, and whilst the Battle of Cape Finisterre was indecisive, thanks in part to fog, and in part to Calder not being as willing to engage against the odds as Jervis had been, it did serve to deflect the enemy fleet from their course, such that they would eventually wind up at Cadiz rather than on the Channel coast, with a special shout-out in that battle to HMS Malta for taking on 5 enemy capital ships at once, and forcing 2 of them to surrender. The Victory would, after a brief diversion to England, rejoin and strengthen the British forces off Cadiz, with a total of 27 ships of the line to face off against 33 French and Spanish vessels. The subsequent Battle of Trafalgar will get its own detailed video at some point in the future, so we won't go into it in extreme detail here, but Victory once again showed her speed, leading one of 2 British columns into the heart of the enemy formation and taking fire from half a dozen enemy capital ships, including Santissima Trinidad, on the way in. One enterprising man aboard decided that a small keg of 500 musket balls made an excellent addition to the 68-pounder carronades heavy shot when the call came for double and then treble shotting, and thus carrying the world's biggest shotgun and flying the famous signals "England expects every man will do his duty," followed by "engage the enemy more closely," the Victory broke through the line between the French flagship, the 80-gun third-rate Bucentaure, and the 74-gun third-rate Redoutable. At a range so close that the flames of the guns were singeing the windows of the French flagship before the shockwave and cannonballs arrived, the Victory's port guns unleashed a devastating rolling broadside, raking the French flagship from the stern, blowing a hole in it described as large enough to drive a coach and 4 horses through. This dismounted guns and shredded the crew in a maelstrom of cannonballs, grape shot, and the 500 musket balls from the carronade, killing or wounding somewhere between 300 and 450 men of the ship's 750 to 800 man complement in a matter of seconds. Exact numbers of casualties and crew total depends on which report you believe. At a stroke, however, the French flagship was rendered out of action and mostly an afterthought to be used for target practice by subsequent British vessels. Victory then fell in alongside Redoutable, whose captain had enterprisingly trained his crew in sharpshooting and close action in the absence of anything better to do while stuck in Cadiz, and would thus spend most of the rest of the battle alternately blasting away at the French ship and putting out the fires that her guns had started lest they spread back onto the Victory, with the French concentrating on clearing the main deck of the Victory with small arms fire. Nelson was fatally wounded by a sharpshooter in Redoutable's masts and carried below, the French ship eventually giving up the fight when HMS Temeraire wandered past and blasted most of the gathering French boarding party clean off the deck. Having effectively tanked a good portion of the enemy fleet on the way in and been exposed to further fire from enemy ships whilst locked in with Redoutable, Victory was badly damaged and was not able to move under her own sail, as they were rather more an interesting collection of holes held together with a bit of canvas than anything else. HMS Neptune would therefore tow her to Gibraltar for repairs before she would carry Nelson's preserved body back to England for a state funeral. With this battering endured, the now 40-year-old ship was considered too old and damaged to be repaired again back to first-rate status, and so 2 of the lower deck 32-pounders were removed, and the middle gun deck 24-pounders were replaced with 18-pounders, with the ship moved to second-rate classification. By 1810, she was serving as a troop ship, and by 1812, she was a floating depot and prison ship. However, in 1814, she received greater repairs, including the use of the iron bracing you saw earlier in the videos, to strengthen some timbers, and by 1817 she was back out as a first-rate. But 5 years later, by 1822, the rise of new first-rates, the Caledonia class, which themselves, ironically, were based directly on Victory's excellent design, saw her relegated to a guardship and flagship for the Port Admiral at Portsmouth. By 1831, with large ships' timbers in short supply, the Admiralty wanted to break up the ship and reuse her well-seasoned frames in other vessels. Due to a massive public outcry, this plan was scrapped and she was left moored and open for civilian tours. She was allowed to decay further without repair until in the 1880s the future Duke of Somerset noted that "a more rotten ship never probably flew the pennant. I could literally run my walking stick through her sides in many places." In 1887 she sprang a leak and needed a huge emergency effort to stop her sinking at her mooring. This prompted the Admiralty to start putting money aside for maintenance, and from 1889 to 1904, Victory was also used as a naval school of telegraphy. The school was moved off following the ironclad HMS Neptune, a successor to the ship that had towed Victory back to Gibraltar after Trafalgar, breaking her tow line on her way into Portsmouth and ramming the Victory. This obviously caused a rather major hole, and more efforts were needed to keep the ship afloat. Full of bright ideas, the Admiralty again proposed that she be scrapped, but with the 100th anniversary of Trafalgar approaching and the personal intervention of Edward VII, who was king at the time, this was fortunately put aside yet again. But with the escalating costs of the naval arms race that preceded World War I, little else was done until by 1921 the ship was in a very poor state, again. This led to another public intervention with the Save the Victory campaign, which resulted in the ship being moved to No. 2 dock at Portsmouth, the oldest dry dock in the world still in use at the time. After a lot of speculation as to her eventual location, the fact that the hull probably wouldn't survive being moved meant that the decision was made to keep her in dry dock permanently. Restoration work throughout the 1920s brought the ship back up to acceptable structural strength, although minor work would continue up until the Second World War, when the Luftwaffe unhelpfully bombed her. But the ship proved tougher than the newfangled air power, and the damage was able to be repaired. Over the following decades, rotten wood and 19th century additions were removed and replaced with new planking and a gradual program of restoration to her Trafalgar condition. In 1990, a 4-year-old Druckenfell stepped off a train in Portsmouth Harbour with his grandmother and was taken through the gates of the historic Dockyard on a fine summer's day to see the first real warship that he'd ever seen in person. The sight of a fully rigged first-rate looming large in the sunlight sparked a love of naval history that in large part is why you're listening to this channel today. The restoration work to original condition was finally completed in time for the Trafalgar 200 celebrations and the accompanying fleet review in 2005. In 2012, her care was handed over to the National Museum of the Royal Navy, which meant that whilst the ship is still a commissioned warship of the Royal Navy, you could now take photographs aboard, which was previously forbidden. More recently, the upper masts and rigging were removed to allow for more extensive refitting to take place, since her long stay in dry dock has meant that the hull and decks have begun to sag due to the stress imposed by the 22 large cradles that she'd sat in for the past several decades. These are now being replaced by a far more numerous 134 props, which you saw earlier in the video, which will distribute the load far better and allow the ship to be restored to a technically seaworthy state. And so with that, we conclude our tour of HMS Victory. Maybe one day in a few years' time we'll be back and her master rigging will be in their full glory and the bits that are being closed off for renovation won't be closed off. But there you go, and I'll return you back to recorded narration.
That's it for this video. Thanks for watching. If you have a comment or suggestion for a ship to review, let us know in the comments below. Don't forget to comment on the pinned post for dry dock questions.